The following is intended for informational purposes only. It is intended to supplement classroom training and documentation. It should not be relied on as a replacement or substitute for classroom training with a live expert instructor. This workshop uses ProcessFlow to create a custom registration form. This example registration form is for training purposes only. In no way does it replace the existing base registration form. Welcome to Lesson 5 of Config Tools. And here we will be looking for the first time at the actual scripting language itself. We have shown you until now how we develop a business object using the schema designer. We've created a registration form type and a registration form. And now we would like to create a plugin, something that the business object will do when it actually posts the registration form to create the actual person entity. And we will be looking at this example of creating person and describing the scripting language and its syntax and other aspects where we can get extra help with the application. The use of XPath, which is also important, and explain what exactly that is, and XML syntax to actually explore XML structure, which is used within the actual scripting language. And we'll also show a good IDE that we have found, Notepad++, which is useful to actually write your scripts. Create the code necessary to create that person entity. So before I actually show you the script, let me show you what the final product will look like for today after we've added in the script. What we will do is have a process flow, either a business registration form which uses the person type of business or the individual one. Let's take the business one for an example. And let's call a business call, just call it supermarket. ABC. And at this stage, in the pending state of the registration form, you can see that we have the name on the form, but we have not yet created any entity person. If I activate this now, you will see it comes up with a warning that we don't have an address for the person, but we haven't added addresses in yet. We just ignore that, say yes, and you see that a supermarket person entity has been created. If we click on that, you will see that we have created a person of type business. The person name is there. There's no address information, and because we haven't dealt with that yet. But somehow this registration form has been able to create the person entity. How did we do that? We'll look at that now. So if we go to the business object, the registration form, we go back to the life cycle. In the active state, I have added in what is called a plugin enter algorithm. We have under algorithms different events: enter, exit, monitor. We're looking at enter events, status enter events, and we can write in an algorithm. In this case, we have one called registration form add person, and it's associated with a script. If I click on the algorithm, it takes me to the algorithm details. And an algorithm is always backed by an algorithm type. Difference between an algorithm type and an algorithm is only in the sense that an algorithm can add in some what is called soft parameters so that you can have a slightly different customized algorithms based upon the same algorithm type. In this particular case, we don't have any algorithms, and we go directly to the algorithm type. And you see that there are some things here that are worth looking at. Every algorithm type, besides its name, description, and so on, very important is the algorithm entity. This is where this algorithm is plugged into the system. And we have seen how it's plugged in the system on the business object, on the status, on the enter. Meaning as a specific transaction registration form process flow enters this state of active, this particular piece of code will run. And what code will run? Well, the program type here tells you the different types of underlying code that can be used to write the logic, whatever logic that we're interested in writing. And there are two ways of doing it, either using a plug-in script or Java. This whole course, Config Tools, is going to be discussing scripting. We are not discussing here the Java option. The Java option is something which will be looked at if one follows the SDK course, tutorials and material, which teaches you how to use Java as a way of expanding and creating new plugins using Java. Here we're going to be using what is called a plugin script and scripting. And we've already seen a little bit of scripting when we saw the service script on the business object option types. But we are now going to look at that in much more detail. So this particular example is a plugin script, and here is the actual plugin script, and we can click on it and now look at what it is. So we have three tabs: a main, a step, and a data area. The script has a description, a name, and again a script type here defines the types of scripts that you can write. And in fact you can create three different types: a BPA script, a business process assistant script, a plugin script, or service script. The one we're looking at, and perhaps the simplest one to start with, is a plugin script. A plugin script is a specific script piece of code which runs within a particular part of the process flow, the business rules within a PSRM. And in this case, we know where it's running. It runs within the point of a business object status enter point. That's the plugin spot. That's where the code runs. A BPA script always begins its life with someone on the front end, on the actual user interface, clicking on something, and that invokes a BPA script. A service script is never invoked directly. It's a piece of code running on the server which can be run via a plugin script or a BPA script. Anyway, we are looking now at plugin script, and the point, and the very first thing to sort of understand about any plugin script is the inputs that the system gives to this plugin script based upon, and it's all going to be determined by the algorithm entity. Algorithm entity here being business object status enter. Certain pieces of information are passed to this plugin spot so that the plugin spot can actually calculate, do whatever logic that we will need to do, and then at the end place its result in some sort of output. Now the inputs and outputs, where are they defined? How are they defined? First thing to look at is look at data area. Third tab, skipping step for a moment, and let's disregard what we see over here, but this is the first thing I want to show you. View plugin script data area. This is the inputs and the outputs of this particular plugin spot. And we see over here, under Palm, we have something called soft and hard. Soft are the parameters, the extra information which would be given to this particular script if in fact we had different algorithms with soft parameters based upon the one given algorithm type. So you could have different soft parameters here and values. But generally, if it's not so, we don't have any differences between our algorithm and our algorithm type. There are no soft parameters. we won't have anything under soft, and the only thing we'll look is hard. And this is what will be inputted into this plugin spot. And you see over here, use input. What will be given always is an ID. The ID, which particular business object is being passed to this script. In this case, we know for sure what it is, because it's in fact, we actually have to define the BO which is associated with this script. So it's going to be the value, in our case, that we saw on the mains tab, where we defined the registration form. That will be the ID. We are also given the primary key, and in this case, the primary key happens to be the process flow ID, and it knows this information because, again, we've already defined the business object on the main tab. So I know what, but not what is actually given to the plugin spot is the process flow ID, a specific value, so that it can take that information and use that as its starting point. And then in terms of outputs, the output of the business of this plugin spot can deal, and we see over here we have some outputs related to next statuses, related to the status if I want to actually move this particular transaction registration form to a specific next status. We could define the next statuses in these output places. However, these are not the only things that the plugin can do. It doesn't have to only just move things to the next status. It can do, in fact, based upon the inputs, whatever it needs to do. And in our case, we have work to do. We want to create a person entity. We want to create, based upon the information that we know on the registration form, mainly the name and the person type. We're going to use that information and create a person, and create a person entity. Now, we don't only have to use these inputs. We can actually use other data areas, and that's why we have not only this area to use, but we can actually define our own areas, data areas, which we will use to either query the business object or to update a particular entity or create a new entity. We'll see this. So for example, we have at the moment shown in this example 4 different business object data areas. The last 2 here are going to be used to query the registration form for information, and then the first 2 are going to be used for creating the actual person entity. Now, I actually have created 3 different types of scripts. And you see this V1. I've actually created V1, V2, V3. And what I've done is try to show you step by step a simplified version of creating a script to create the person entity, and then slowly build up and make it more complicated. In the end, you will see we won't necessarily need to have all this information, these data areas. But for the version 1 example that we have here, we do have these data areas defined. Now, we've skipped over the step, the second tab. The second tab is where you actually code. We actually put in the information needed to all the business logic in a sort of scripting language to create the person entity. Now, I have chosen to create one step, and it's called an edit data step type edit data. However, it is not the only step available to you. There are many step types. However, edit data is by far the most important one. In fact, everything that you can do in all the other steps can be also been done within edit data. Some people, some coders, some scripters prefer to break out their scripts into multiple steps, or they will use these other type of step types. I, in this course, are going to show you how we can do a simplified not necessarily simplify, but this is my personal preference, to just write everything in one step under one step type called edit data. So everything that I need to do is now done in one piece of code. And in fact, you can see the code. You can't see all of it here. If I click on Show Editor, this is the code that I have written in the scripting language to create the person entity, and we'll be looking at this in a moment in depth. However, just again, many scripts that you may look at within the actual system, and we use scripting a lot within the base PSRM, you will see that they have multiple steps. They might use multiple step types. Again, my point here is, and I'm just underline this point, this is my personal preference, and you'll see in a minute that the reason why I'm doing is also that I can use an external editor to make life easier to look at the code. I prefer to use just one step, and a step type edit data, where you can write everything within the code in a simple, unified way. Okay, I just mentioned now that I use an external editor. The reason for this is that I could actually write directly within this particular box over here. However, it is a little, I would say, it's not forgiving. If I make mistakes, it doesn't necessarily tell me where my mistake is, and it doesn't actually highlight specialized words, the syntax of the code that we use. So because of this, I prefer to take the code and place it into another editor. So let us start looking at the code of the script. First of all, I'd like to point out some useful places where you can get help about the syntax of the script. If you go within the product itself and you're in a particular script, I'm in this particular step over here, I will see on the right hand side view a list of edit data step type commands, and over here you'll get the main documentation about scripting. So everything that you actually want to learn starts with this particular document, which you can use and browse through when you have time, and you can look it up as you get stuck. I'm not going to go through it now with you. We're going to hit upon many of these concepts and many of these particular syntaxes as we go in and we look at an example. Buried within this syntax is actually another language, a specific language, which is XPath. XPath is a querying XML type of language, which is defined. It's a standard which has been defined by W3C recommendation, and there's documentation on the web that you can find, and there are particular types of ways of dealing with XML which XPath uses and defines, and we sometimes use functions specifically of XPath within our script. So when I look at a particular script, it's actually a combination of proprietary Oracle commands and syntaxes as well as XPath. In fact, in the main tab over here, we define the XPath level. Script engine version refers to the XPath level. And as I said, you can find online the different documentation and the functions that XPath uses. So when we look at an example of an actual script, I will point out to you parts which are actually specifically Oracle, let's call it framework scripting, Oracle framework, and some of it is actually XPath. So, as I said, we're going to be using Notepad++ as our editor, and you see that we have shown now the piece of code which creates a person in Notepad. And what I'd like to do is really just go through line by line what this code is doing, and this will be a way of introducing you to the actual syntax and the language. Okay, as I told you, the first thing that we have within our input data area for the plugin is the process flow ID. That is already filled in for you. So this line move this particular process flow ID to this place over here is actually just taking the process flow and putting it into another data area which we've defined. If we look at our particular if we look at our data areas that we have, we will see that one of our data areas is reg form, and that is the actual registration form business object data area. So we're just simply moving it into the process flow underneath the registration form. And then this is extremely important, invoke BO. We are doing basically a read of the business object. Since we've passed in the process flow ID, which is like the primary key of the business object, then we can do an invoke BO. We're invoking which BO, the CM registration form, using the data area which we have defined again, over here. We've defined, this is our data area. And we're reading the data. And once we've read the data, what we have filled in as a result of doing the invoke BO, we have actually got an output information. Let me try to explain this better by looking at looking online now and looking at the actual data area which we have defined here. What we did was we passed in the process flow ID into here, and then we invoked the BO. And the invoke BO is equivalent in some way as in a little bit in like an SQL where I'm doing a where clause by the actual primary key of the particular table. The equivalent is doing a invoke BO based upon the primary key of the business object is primary key, you see, is true. And what we do is, as a result of doing the invoke BO, data over here has been filled in, and particularly the one which we're interested in is this one here. And if I actually highlight name, you will see that we actually get the place within the XML where the name is going to be shown. So when I go back to the code, when I do an invoke BO, I then move my data, which is now filled with the data with the name, for example, the supermarket ABC that I used before, into and you see if it is $ name, this is just a local variable, which I'm calling name. Okay, so now I have the name information. Okay, once I have the name information, the next thing I would like to do is get the person type. And how do I do that? Very similar to what I did before in the last 3 lines here. What I'm going to do is move the process flow type. Now, the process flow type, I received that information the same way that I got the name. The name was filled in as a result of doing the invoke BO. As a result of the invoke BO, I now have the process flow type inside the registration form BO, and I'm moving it now to a new data area, which I'm going to now be using to invoking the admin BO, the registration form type BO. So then I'm going to do invoke BO on the admin on the type. Since I have the primary key, I will have my data now filled in, and then I do a similar thing I did before. The output is my person type, and I'm moving it to my local variable person type. Okay? Once I have my person type and now have my name, I can now then decide, okay, let me go to let me create my entity, my person entity. So what I'm doing here, I have an if clause, if, and I have actually here a function, a string function. And this is the first example that we're seeing a function of XPath. Anything within double quotes is actually a XPath function. So I'm saying take the person type, which I've just got actually over here, and I'm going to get the string value of it and see if it is equivalent of B. And if the value is B, in other words, the person type is defined as business, then I will create a person using a specific type of business object called person legal entity. Okay, so this is not actually 100% accurate in a way that I'm actually making a certain assumption. I'm making an assumption that if, in fact, the person type is actually equal to B, business, then I'm going to, it's only if a person type is equal to B, then I'm going to use this legal, and then I'm using this actual particular business object. Who says that the person type B is always linked to person legal entity? An assumption I'm just making for now. Later on we will actually make this this code better. Okay, but at the moment I'm making assumption if the person type is equal to B, which if you look up is business, then I'm going to use the legal entity business object. And now let's see how we actually create the person entity. Well, here I'm going to be now moving in the person type into the BO person legal entity. Again, all these BOs data areas have already been defined. They've been defined over here in my script, and that's the point. Now I've actually ahead of time defined the data areas, and these are available for me to use. So the first thing I do is I move in my person type. I also move in my the name, and in order to move the name in, I first of all have to define the name type, and it's going to be primary. And in fact, you see this plus over here. Well, because actually the person name is actually a list, in order to create a new list, I need to actually use the plus sign. So you'll see the plus sign whenever I actually create a first entry into a particular list, has this plus sign there. More information, please look again on online in the syntax, which describes better. I have to put in a true value, is primary name, and then I take my name, which I've defined above, and I move the name into the entity name. Okay, I'm going to use entity name when it is a business, because the person legal entity has an entity name value. Okay, how do I know what I need to fill in? Well, one way to do that again is to go back to your script, look at your data areas, look at your person legal entity, and you can look at the data area and you can see what needs to be filled in. So what I'm actually filling in is first of all the person type. This is my list person name. I'm filling in my name type. The entity name is primary name, and that's sufficient for me to actually create the user. Once I've actually done that, now we're doing another invoke BO. Before we used invoke BO for read, now we're doing an invoke BO for add, because we're adding a new entry into the person entity. So I do it for add, and as a result of doing a for add, I've actually get in my person legal entity. Now I get actually the person ID. You get the primary key returned as a result of doing the for add. I have my person ID, and what I'm going to do for my person ID, I'm actually going to put it onto the registration form itself, and this links my registration form to my entity that I've just created. Now, after I've done that, I have to update my registration form because now I've moved it in. It's not saved automatically. So I have to do another invoke BO. Now this time I'm doing it on the registration form for what's called a fast update, updating the registration form BO with the person ID. And I have a very similar type of code in the case where the person is not a B, person type is not B, it's anything other than business. Then I'm going to assume that I'm going to use the person individual business object. And in this case, it's similar code except for when it comes to the name. In this case of business, we could put in the name directly into entity name. But if I look at person individual, going back to my online, I can look at the actual data area again now for individual. You will see the person name has entity name, but in fact that's not the way you enter in a individual person. To create an individual person, what you do is you fill in your first name, middle name, last name, and so on. And as a result of filling those in, the entity name is actually updated. So we don't, in this case, add directly into the entity name. We add in the first name and the last name. So that is actually why we have this if statement. And what I'm doing over here is saying, well, since at the moment I have just one field for entering the name on my form, I need to actually extract the first and last name, and I'm using here a substring before and after function, which is actually, again, because it's within double quotes, it's this XPath function, and you could find that in the XPath documentation. And you could, by the way, in terms of XPath, there are different versions. We saw 2.0, there's also 3, and there's 1. 2.0, you should be able to use also XPath 1 as well. And this is a function which is in XPath 1, and it's a substring before, and it's basically taking out everything before the space, because I expect the name to be placed in at the moment. For example, my name, David Eisenthal, it's David and a space Eisenthal. So what I would do is, first of all, get my, before the space, get the David part and put that into first name, and then it will take the everything after the space in the name will pick up my last name and place it into the last name. After I've done that, I can then do the invoke BO in the same way that I did previously in the case of a business, and again I do an add, and in the same way I did an update to do an update to the person ID on the registration form. Okay. This, I want to point out, is not a perfect way of doing a script. There are certain simplifications that I have done, and in a moment we'll see some better ways of doing certain functionality features that we did within the script in a better way. However, I wanted to just show you that if I go back now to my to the application, we showed you, for example, demoed the person entity being created for a business. It also works for individual. So if I use an individual, as we just saw in the code, the expectation is that I would put in my first name and last name with a space. So if I put in the name Fred and space blogs, like that, and I save that, now the process flow type is individual, and the individual has a person type. If I go to the registration form type, you see the person type is individual. So therefore it's not business, so therefore it will now go into the else part of the code when I now create, activate, and hopefully what it will do is it will extract Fred and put Fred into the first name, blogs into the last name, and it'll create now a person entity correctly. So if I do activate now, it comes up with the same warning to do with address, and I have now created Fred blogs entity, and you'll see over here that the person is being created. And I look into the entity person itself, you will see that I have first name and last name correctly defined with a person type to be individual. Okay, so this is our first example of a script. I hope that it's relatively clear what I have done, the steps that I've taken. I suggest that you look at this for a few minutes, and then we will now, in a moment, go on and create a better version of this particular script. Okay, so in order to do that, let me show you a couple of issues that we have with this particular script that we should want to improve. The first thing that we see is that we made an assumption. We made an assumption that if the person type is business, then we'd use this particular business object for the person. Now, if I go to the actual application, I can go and find the process flow type, and here is my person type defined, in this case individual, and we said if it's individual then we will make the assumption it's the person BO is a certain type, but in fact the person BO is defined directly on the person type. So in fact we should actually be querying the person type in order to get the information of what individual person what person BO to use. Now this is the point. Is a point I want to make clear. In order to query anything, we always query in script using the business object. Now, for the person type, the business object happens to be something called individual person type. If I go to business, it uses a different business object because it has actually different information here than the individual one has. So I am unable to simply now query person type with a given BO, because in fact the BO information is dependent on what person type it is. So what I'm going to need to do if I want to query the person type is to first of all find out what business object to use. Okay, and therefore I have, let me go back to my script. And now I'm going to show you another script, which is the next better, in other words, a better version of this I have over here. And this one is going to have slightly different data areas. And one of them is going to be, we're going to use a business service called determine business object. And you're going to see that now in the code that I'm going to show you. Again, this code is exactly the same in terms of functionality-wise as the one that we saw previously, but this one is more correct. So let's just summarize what we have in this particular next version of the script. We see that we have a similar thing, exactly the same as before. We retrieve the name and we retrieve the type of the person type. But now I'm not going to make an assumption that the person BO is dependent on a particular person type, but rather I'm going to determine the particular I'm going to determine the BO of the person by first of all querying and getting the person type BO. Okay, in order to determine a BO, and as I mentioned before, why do we need to determine the person type BO? Because we don't actually know, it's not a fixed BO for all person types. We need to actually take the maintenance object, which is fixed for all BOs of person type, and take the person type, and we can use an invoke BS. Invoke BS is invoke a business service. It's not querying the business object, but in this case it's actually querying something called business service, which we will talk about a little bit later. And in this case, we see it defined in our data area over here, business service. And the business service responsibility is to actually give as an input a maintenance object and the primary key and come out with the business object. And that is what we have over here. We're invoking a business object and we're getting the BO of the person type. So now I know for specific person type primary key, I now know the BO, and I'm going to now, once I know the BO, I can now use that in order to query it to get, and what's the reason why we're querying it? In order to get the person BO. It's called the related person BO. Now, because I don't know ahead of time what the BO of the person type will be, I have not defined now, in this particular example, in the schema type, I have not defined ahead of time what the actual BO will be, because I don't know what it will be. It's determined by the invoke business service. So what we now have is the ability to actually dynamically define a data area. Using a declare BO, we can actually define a data area dynamically without setting it ahead of time. And that would mean that we do not actually have to define them in the data area over here. And I have now declared a BO of person type, and I've actually given it a name. And once I've done a dynamic definition, I've created the person type, I can then use it in exactly the same way as if the data area was defined ahead of time. So again, I'm now doing similar to what we did before. We move the person type into the newly defined person type data area, and since we know the BO, because we actually just got that by using our determine invoke business service, since I actually have now retrieved that through the determine BO, I can now use the invoke BO on the BO person type using our newly defined dynamic data area, and I can read it and I can get, as a result of that, the related person BO. The related person BO being the whole reason why we did this is to get the person BO so that I can now create the person. Okay. Now, since I have the BO, I will use a declare BO in the same way as I had before, dynamically create the BO as person. And now I can actually create, move person type in, move primary and true in. And the only thing I still need to do is I still need an if clause, because if the person BO happens to be legal entity, then I'm going to have to move the name in, and otherwise I'm going to be moving in the substring using the function and splitting the name into its pieces if it's an individual person. Okay, so what I've introduced here in the second version of this script is some very important concepts, mainly invoke business service, specific one that we're going to use again and again, determine BO, and also in a declare BO, where you can dynamically create a data area. Finally, in a third version of this script, I've actually used the dynamic data area definition also to define not only the person type BO, but also the registration form and the registration form type. Okay, so you will see over here that I actually have the business object, but I do a declare BO over here. And in the case of for the registration type BO, I'm going to be using the invoke BS for the process flow type. This allows me to be basically completely free from defining ahead of time any data areas. So if I look at in the final version of this script that I have, this is the script actually, which is exactly the same as the one you see here of create person. So what you actually have here in terms of your data areas, you actually have no data areas related to the business object defined, because I've actually using a declare BO instead. Okay, and that's why we can clean up this data areas, and I'm only using the business service ahead of time to be defined. Okay, so in the end, these three versions of the script do exactly the same thing. However, the third one is in some way the most dynamic and the most flexible. It doesn't rely upon hard coding the person type business to a particular person BO. We've actually taken the person BO from the person type by querying the person type BO and getting the transaction BO. And it makes our code much simpler in some way without the very large ifs that we had previously. However, what we do see is that in order to actually query any business object and using a dynamic data area, there actually needs quite a lot of pieces of code in order to do that. And sometimes that's why our scripts seem to be rather long, and you wonder when you first look at them why they actually need so much information. If I already have my primary key, why can't I just query the table? But understand again that we never query a table directly or maintenance object directly. We always query in script the BO. And that's because data doesn't necessarily found in a real field in the actual underlying table, and therefore we can't just query the maintenance object. Sometimes it's actually in the XML and the BO data area, and that's why by using an invoke BO we can actually relate to all those underlying fields in the same way, regardless of whether they're actually in real fields or whether they're actually in the BO data area. And that is the benefit of using an invoke BO. However, again, as a result of that, if we want to, especially if we want to use a dynamic data area, the code becomes rather large in order to actually do one basic action. And in this particular case, just querying the BO. So overall, we're querying to summarize what the script this is doing, what we're doing, again, we're querying the registration BO to get the name, we're querying the registration type to get the person type, we're querying the person type in order to get we're querying the person type in order to get the related person BO, and now I have the person BO, then I can move in my data into the person BO, and I just need to make sure that if it's a name, if it is a business, then I use the name field, the name I put on the registration form in whole, and I can put directly into entity name. And if I if not, I will split it up individual pieces and put the first name into first name using a XPath function. You might say, you know what, why don't I just always move everything into why don't I always just forget these ifs, just always move everything into entity name, first name, last name? What would happen if I tried to actually move this substring, for example, this line in a case when it was a person legal entity? Well, what will happen is that since the legal entity does not have a first name, it won't be able to find first name, and it will error, and there will be and the script will stop, and there will be the system will stop, and the actual entity person will not be created. We have not shown here how we actually debug a particular script. There are some debugging tools to help you work if you make mistakes, and that is something we'll deal with separately. Here I'm just showing you the outcome and the ultimate piece of code that is needed in order to run and create this person entity. So what have we learned in this lesson? We have seen an introduction to the Oracle scripting, the PSRM scripting language that we use in order to write plugins. We have looked at different commands which are generally used: invoke BO, and declare BO, invoke BS, a move, and many others, and we'll be seeing more and more as we go along. Within the scripting, we have the other language, the standard XPath language, which are used to move data and declare XML data and to manipulate that XML data, and that's called XPath. So that's something that one needs to also be aware of, as well as the actual Oracle scripting language. We have shown you where you can get help online through the help both for XPath and also help for the scripting within PSRM. I've shown you that the development editor that I use is Notepad++, and it highlights certain of the commands which are useful, because if you actually just script directly within the product itself, you don't get any of that, and it's difficult for you to actually see if you make any mistakes.